friends, welcome back to another Before You Read lecture. This is our second lecture in a series focusing on reading the Gospel of John without anti-Semitism. And as we continue our journey together of the choices and the moves that we can make as Christian interpreters of this Christian text, that we would learn to read and interpret it and understand it in a way that is not promoting anti-Judaism or anti-Semitism. At sometimes we're going to be able to do that by having a deeper grasp of the historical context in which it was written, or having some information or understanding about the nature of Judaism in antiquity. Other times, though, we may have to read more against the grain. We may have to be more intentional in the decisions that we are making as interpreters. So for this week, we are going to broadly be focusing on John chapters 2, 3, and 4, especially the way that John tells a story about Jesus's incident at the temple in chapter 2, his conversation with Nicodemus, who is identified as a leader of the Jews, and his discussion with the Samaritan woman in chapter 4. And the central question for this week's study together is, how can we understand the portrait of Jesus in the Gospel of John against the broader Jewish movements that were in existence at the time of the New Testament? So in other words, how does understanding the variety and diversity of Judaism in the first century help us understand the portrait of Jesus in the Gospel of John? So that is what we're focusing on this week. And our primary conversation partner is going to be Daniel Schwartz in his short article in the Jewish Annotated New Testament Study Bible on the Jewish movements in the time of the New Testament. I want to start by saying that I found this chapter, this short article, to offer a fairly novel way of understanding first century Judaism. There were some things that I was familiar with, and then there were some ways that Dr. Schwartz conceptualizes them that felt different to me, that felt novel to me. And so I want to just walk through this article, this chapter. I'd encourage you to read it on your own, but walk through it and sort of highlight some of the key points about the diversity and variety of Judaism in the ancient world. The first thing that Schwartz does in this piece is just to sort of lay out for us the variety of names or groups that were associated with Jews in antiquity. And so the first thing that he mentions is one that is probably the least familiar to us. It's the Asidaioi, or the pious or religious people. This seems to be the earliest self-designation that we're aware of. And from there, we get into more familiar territory with the discussion of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, or the Qumran community, as he sometimes combines them, and the Sicarii, or the Zealots, which are identified as the fourth philosophy by the historian Josephus. And another sort of name that's in the mix is the Yachad. The Yachad is the self-designation of those who settled at or near Qumran. Sometimes they're called the Qumran community. They're associated very often with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And Schwartz does what a number of scholars of ancient Judaism do, which is to identify the Essenes and those who are identified as the Yachad, those who were sort of the Covenanters around Qumran. Schwartz is going to say those are basically the same group. And I will point out that there is some significant disagreement with that among scholars of ancient Judaism, although it is somewhat of a standard or traditional view to see those connections. From these varieties of groups, particularly the four philosophies and the mention of the Yachad at Qumran, Schwartz suggests that actually we can boil ancient Judaism down to two basic orientations. One that is represented by the Pharisees, and the other that is represented by the Sadducees. And then he uses these sort of orientations to locate the other Jewish groups on the circle, or on the spectrum, the pendulum, if you will. And so Pharisees, he says they are known because they're primarily oriented toward the Jewish law. That they can be understood as a sort of proto-rabbinic movement because of how Pharisees are said to focus on the law, and because of the ways that the rabbinic Judaism focused on the law and its proper interpretation. The Pharisees, the name the Pharisees, probably relates to their more stringent interpretation of the law, or their desire to have the most accurate interpretation of the law. In contrast to the Pharisees, Schwartz says that the Sadducees are primarily oriented towards the high priesthood and to the temple establishment in Jerusalem. And so the name Sadducees derives from the name Zadok, who was the name of the high priest during the time of David and Solomon. And so what Schwartz does is he connects the Sadducees with the Essenes, or the Yahad community at Qumran, because they too were also oriented towards the priesthood and purity matters and a temple, although they were suggesting a rival temple and a rival priesthood to those of the Sadducees. And so we get these two basic orientations, and Schwartz gives us some further distinctions. He tells us that we can see that these two orientations differ in terms of how they understand the origins of the office and even the identity of Jews. They differ in terms of the orientation to sacred space or geography. They have different views of outsiders, and they have a different view of the law. And so I want to talk about each of these four briefly. So first, Pharisees and Sadducees view the office of priest or Pharisee differently. Priests, as you probably know, are a matter of genealogy. You're born into the priesthood. And then, in contrast, the Pharisees say, no, actually, you achieve office when you've showed yourself to be an excellent interpreter or student of Torah. And this then has a broader implication that the Sadducees and the priestly orientation would say one is Jewish by birth, largely by independent of their own decisions, and the Pharisees would say, no, wait, you choose to be a Jew. And this was particularly true of Jews that were living outside of Judea in the first century, who had a much stronger choice to be Jewish. It was more demanding of them to be Jewish than those maybe who were living in Judea, according to Schwartz. The second area of distinction is with regard to geography and sacred space. So the priests, the priestly orientation is going to focus on the temple in Jerusalem. So there is one sacred space, and by extension, there is one sacred country we could see. And so we can begin to see why the priestly orientation is going to be more interested in, more oriented towards nationalistic concerns about Jerusalem. For the Pharisees, their office, their work as Jews, their expression of their Judaism is not limited to one geographical location. Instead, what we see happening in the New Testament period, and probably for the 100 or 200 years before that period, is the creation of houses of study and synagogues. These were places where Jews could convene together for fellowship, for study, for worship, that were throughout the ancient world. So you can see how this idea of sacred space has been distilled or dispersed throughout the ancient world. Schwartz says that the priestly orientation and the Pharisaic orientation have different views of outsiders. Priests, he says, are largely uninterested in mission. They're largely closed off to non-Jews because, again, one is a priest because one is born that way. One is a Jew because one is born that way. And so you could see them putting perhaps stronger boundaries between insiders and outsiders. For the Pharisees, who think that Judaism is more a matter of choice, they're more open to converts. They're more open to Gentiles being participants in that lifestyle, in that religion. And finally, the two orientations have a different view of the law. The Sadducees and the priestly orientation, Schwartz says, are going to have a higher value on natural law. They're going to have a higher value on sort of that which is natural or even revealed law through the Torah. Whereas the Pharisees, I love what Schwartz says, the Pharisees say that human decisions endow things with legal status. So the interpretation of Torah, the correct interpretation of Torah, leads then to the decision to say, this is the law, this is the right way to do things. The rest of the article, or that short article, is about sort of locating where other schools or other Jewish groups kind of fit within that spectrum of Pharisaic and priestly Judaism. And so Schwartz would say that diaspora Judaism, the Judaism outside of Judea in the first century, is even further to the left of the Pharisees. They would say that being Jewish is a choice, and that in many ways the premises of Hellenization, of ancient Hellenism, and diaspora Judaism are very compatible. And then Schwartz says that the Essenes are to the right of the Sadducees. They are more consistent than the Sadducees. They put a greater emphasis on purity and the priesthood than even the Sadducees. And then even further to the right would then be the Sicarii and the Zealots, according to Schwartz, because of their extreme focus on national interest. And remember, the Zealots are those who would be willing to take up arms to disrupt the rule of Rome in the land of Judea, to protect those national interests, even to the point of going to war. What does all of this matter for us and for our study of the Gospel of John? Well, I think it reminds us again, it reinforces something that we have talked about, that Judaism in antiquity was varied and diverse. It also reminds us that Jewish identity and practice and convictions were also contested. These were not solidified, concluded conversations in the first century. They were ongoing and they were contested issues. And again, these two basic orientations, the Pharisaic orientation that's focused on the law, the importance of decision, less focused on the temple in Jerusalem, or this narrow geographical focus on the Jewish religion, and the priestly orientation, the focus on the temple and holy space, the importance of birth, and a more nationalistic understanding of the temple and of sacred space. I think these two basic orientations can be helpful for us as we read the New Testament. And so that's, I think, the major payoff, is having some of this understanding of the variety, the diversity, the contested nature of Judaism in antiquity can help us understand a little bit of what's going on in the pages of the New Testament. And so for this week, here is the assignment for our time together. One, read this short article by Daniel Schwartz if you have time. I think it'll clarify what I've said in this video lecture. And then two, I want you to read John chapters 2, 3, and 4 with a focus on this sort of understanding of Judaism as diverse, varied, and contested in the first century. And I want you to think about three questions as you read this part of the Gospel of John. One, how does your understanding of Jewish sects or different orientations inform your understanding of what's going on in these chapters? The second is, how is John's Jesus presented in relationship to these sects or orientations? Does the presentation of Jesus in John 2 through 4 align more with a Pharisaic viewpoint or a priestly orientation? And finally, how might this information or this knowledge relate to your understanding of John's broader animosity toward the Jews, right? How does this historical, maybe even religious understanding help you navigate this central question of our time together? Friends, I hope the video lecture makes some sense. I hope it clarifies. I hope it gives you some things to think about. Maybe it even raises some questions. I want you to apply that knowledge then to your reading of John chapters 2 through 4, and I look forward to our discussion. Happy reading.